Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to episode 27 of It's Murder Up North. First of all, I just want to thank you all for listening to the show each week. If you are loving the podcast, please let others know by leaving a 5-star review wherever you listen. You can connect with myself and other listeners through Twitter or via the Facebook discussion group. I would especially love to hear your opinions on today's case. I just want to thank my latest Patreon member, Heather. Thank you so much for supporting the show. By becoming a Patreon member, you are helping keep the podcast going. If, like Heather, you would like to become a Patreon member, please visit www.patreon.com/itsmurderupnorth. You will receive a special mention on a future episode to say thank you for your support, and you will have access to exclusive content. Before we head to the episode, please check out my podcast of the week. I've gotten to know Emma, the host of the True Crime Witch podcast, over the last few months, and not only is she a fantastic host who is passionate about her show, she is also a wonderful person, so please show your support for a fellow Northerner. Here is a sneak peek of her show.
Good evening, friends. I'm Emma, the host of the True Crime Witch podcast. Join me every other week as we delve into everything murderous, mysterious, and downright macabre. You can find the podcast by searching the True Crime Witch podcast on all of your favourite podcast apps, and search for us on social media just using the True Crime Witch. Hope to see you there. Remember, friends, stay safe and stay spooky.
Now, let's head to the episode. Wendy sat at her desk, her jet-black hair falling softly about her shoulders, as she continued to organise some files her manager had given her. The tedious task was interrupted by a male visitor, whom Wendy promptly greeted in a professional manner. Yet as her manager lingered in the adjoining office, he noticed that the gentleman seemed to be speaking to Wendy in a loud and abrupt tone. A couple of moments later, Wendy entered her manager's office. Observing he was on the phone, she quickly wrote him a note advising that she planned to get some air and have her lunch break, to which the manager, noting that it was midday, nodded his head in acknowledgement. Leaving the Forestry Commission building where she worked at roughly 20 to 1, the 32-year-old headed along the flagstone pavements on King Street in Bakewell, before turning left to head up Butts Road, a narrow street which passed between century-old limestone houses. The road wound steeply out of the valley and towards the town cemetery. She nodded politely to two workmen who were sat on a wall enjoying their lunch. As Wendy made her way further up the incline in her beige business suit, she stopped momentarily to chat to a friend who was driving in the opposite direction towards Bakewell. Filled with excitement, the 32-year-old told her friend she was on her way to meet her boyfriend, stating that they were going to reconcile following an argument the previous evening. With a smile on her face and a spring in her step, Wendy bid her friend farewell and continued on her way. Butts Road opened out onto Yield Road, and the gated entrance to the town cemetery lay to the left-hand side, guarded by an old gatehouse lodge. Wendy passed through the iron gates and walked until the path split into two parallel tracks, one which ran along the higher part of the cemetery, overlooked by a row of terraced houses known as Burton Edge. This path led to the consecrated chapel, which was now used as a storage place by the council workmen who maintained the grounds. The second path was bordered by a dry stone wall, and beyond which dense woodland stood. Wendy followed this path, making her way past some of the oldest gravestones. She was seen by the groundskeeper heading into the Garden of Remembrance, before she disappeared from view. At 1:20, the ashen-faced groundskeeper frantically hammered on the door of the gatehouse lodge, which was occupied by Wilfred Walker and his wife. He told them he had found a woman who was badly injured in the graveyard, and that they needed to call for help. The groundskeeper was completely unaware how his life was about to change forever. The groundskeeper was 17-year-old Stephen Downing. He had just found Wendy Sewell lying on the path. She had been viciously attacked, but was still conscious. He knelt down beside her to check on her and reassured the injured woman that he was going to get help. Stephen returned swiftly with Wilfred and a couple of workmen who had just arrived at the cemetery. They found Wendy, partly dressed, disorientated and stumbling along the path. Before they could reach her, she fell between two graves, striking her head against the cold headstones, which rendered her unconscious. Wendy was rushed to Chesterfield Hospital. In the ambulance, her arms shook violently, as though she was having a seizure, and her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Despite the best efforts to save her, Wendy never regained consciousness and died 2 days after the attack on the 14th of September 1973. Wendy Crawshaw was born in Sheffield in 1941. The city had been devastated in December 1940 by Nazi bombing raids, which resulted in the loss of over 600 lives and displaced roughly 40,000 people whose homes had been destroyed. Her early years were dominated by the Second World War. However, Wendy found solace in the chaos when she discovered her love of music, which she pursued by studying the subject at college. By the age of 23, she had met and fallen in love with her husband, David Sewell. He had recently graduated from Imperial College London and had returned home to Sheffield to live with his parents. And in March 1964, Wendy and David were married in the local parish church. She was the perfect picture of a blushing bride, in her pure white dress with a high neckline and full-length sleeves. Her lace floor-length veil cascaded over her bobbed black hair. It was the happiest day of her life, and her parents were filled with pride seeing their only child begin this new chapter. The happily married couple settled in their first home, a bungalow on Wydale Crescent in Bakewell. David worked long hours as a physicist for Network Rail. Wendy was often left alone all day in the house. The tedium of being a housewife affected Wendy's mental health, and so she started working as a typist at the magistrate's clerk's office in Bakewell. In 1971, the Sewells purchased Green Farm, an 18th century farmhouse in the village of Middleton by Yulgrave, which lay roughly 5 miles away from the town of Bakewell. The property was in rough shape, and they planned to work together on renovating it with the intention of turning the house into a home. The couple did not have any children. However, at one point they had 9 cats living at the farm, which Wendy doted on. As well as offering room for their beloved pets to roam, the house was perfectly situated for Wendy and her husband, as it allowed them the opportunity to enjoy hiking in the Derbyshire countryside. This picture-perfect life was torn apart on the 14th of September, when Wendy Sewell passed away without regaining consciousness. Her attacker, however, had already been apprehended and had confessed to assaulting her. 17-year-old Stephen Downing, the cemetery groundskeeper, who had claimed to have found the injured woman, had been brought in for questioning, and during his interview with the investigators, he confessed to attacking Wendy, quote, "I don't know what made me do it. I saw this woman walking in the cemetery. I went into the chapel to get the pickaxe handle that I knew was there. I followed her, but I hadn't talked to her and she hadn't talked to me. But I think she knew I was there. I came right up to her, near enough. I hit her twice on the head, on the back of the neck. I just hit her to knock her out. She fell to the ground and she was on her side, and then she was face down. I rolled her over and started to undress her. I pulled her bra off first. I had to pull her jumper up and I just got hold of it until it broke. Then I pulled her pants and knickers off. I started to play with her breasts and then her vagina. I put my middle finger up her vagina. I don't know why I hit her, but it might have been to do with what I had just told you. But I knew I had to knock her out first before I did anything to her. It was only a couple of minutes I was playing with her, but there was a bit of blood on the back of her neck, so I left her and went back to the chapel, got my pop bottle, went to the shop, and then went home to see my mother, and asked her to get a bottle of pop for me because the shop was closed. I suppose I did that so no one would find out that I had hit the woman. I went back to the cemetery about 15 minutes later, went back to see the woman. She was lying on the ground the same way as I had left her, but she was covered in blood on her face and on her back. I bent down to see how she was, and she was semi-conscious, just. She put her hands up to her face and just kept wiping her face with her hand. She'd been doing that when I first knocked her down. I went to the telephone kiosk to ring for the police and an ambulance, so that they would think someone else had done it and I'd just found her. I hadn't any money, so I went to the lodge and asked Wilf Walker if he was on the telephone, and he said he wasn't, so I told him what I had supposed to have found. He came to have a look, and then he went to ask these other blokes in a white van outside the cemetery if they had seen her, but they said they hadn't, so one of them went to the phone for the police. I just stayed there because there was no place to go. In February 1974, Downing appeared in court, and despite initially admitting his guilt, when the teenager took to the stand, he pleaded not guilty. During the 3-day trial, Patrick Bennett QC argued for the prosecution that on Wednesday the 12th of September 1973, Stephen Downing had been at work in Bakewell Cemetery. When he spotted Wendy Sewell, he began to follow the attractive 32-year-old as she made her way along the lower path, which led through the oldest part of the graveyard and as such was less travelled. When they reached a secluded section of the graveyard, the defendant attacked Wendy from behind before proceeding to sexually assault her. The prosecutor then argued that Downing left the injured woman and returned home in an attempt to create an alibi. Dr. Usher, the pathologist who performed the post-mortem, reported that Wendy Sewell had suffered 10 fractures to her skull and concluded these must have been caused by 7 or more violent blows to the head. This contradicted Downing's confession, in which he had claimed he had only struck the victim twice. It had been established that Wendy had been attacked by the handle of a pickaxe, and this obviously formed a major part of the evidence in the trial. Prosecution's forensic expert, Mr. Norman Lee, gave a statement, quote, "There were stains on his trousers, on the knees where he might have kneeled, and on the front of the trousers, mainly on the lower legs. There were also a large number of splashes and heavy smears. There were some smears on the right leg as high as the thighs. These stains would have been visible to the people in the cemetery. In addition, there were some small spots of blood on his t-shirt and his gloves. An examination of Stephen's boots showed a lot of smears and small spots of blood mainly on the front. Mr. Lee did state that it was possible this may have been caused by the defendant standing up after kneeling down. He also confirmed that some of the stains are consistent with Stephen's claim that when he found Wendy he had turned her body over. However, he argued that the small spots of blood could not have ended up on Stephen's clothing due to the victim shaking her head violently, as Stephen had claimed. He said, quote, "I cannot imagine how you would get splashing as small as those in the way Downing is suggesting. If she had flung herself about, then for such tiny spots a lot of energy must have been applied." Mr. Lee argued the spots had come from the defendant violently beating the victim, and claimed that in his opinion the blood on the boots and trousers are evidence that the suspect was in close proximity to the victim during the assault. However, Downing's claim that Wendy shook her head violently was corroborated by the paramedic who transported her to the hospital. He advised that the patient was extremely agitated and was moving around a lot in such a frantic manner that his uniform was coated in blood. G.E. Moss, who worked on behalf of the defence and had examined the evidence, found the pickaxe handle was covered in blood at the thickest section, while the end which had been held by the attacker had blood smears on it. He pointed out that although Stephen had confessed to striking Wendy a couple of times, it was evident from the volume of blood on the murder weapon that this was not the case, and the pathologist report supported this argument. The jury heard from a number of witnesses regarding Stephen's character and his behaviour on the day of the murder. His mother, Juanita Downing, took to the stand. She repeated her son's claim that he had returned home that Wednesday lunchtime to ask her to get him some pop. She also testified that Stephen had checked on a pair of baby hedgehogs he had been nursing. She advised that she had not noticed anything untoward in his behaviour. She described her son as being a lazy boy who had poor timekeeping. On the day of the murder, she noted that Stephen had woken up late. He was in such a rush to leave for work that he had accidentally put on the wrong boots, which he changed when he got home at approximately 1:05. She also stated that Stephen was a quiet, solitary person who had one friend and had never been in a relationship. Witnesses confirmed Juanita's testimony that Stephen seemed to be relaxed and did not appear to be agitated or angry around the time of the murder. They verified that his behaviour seemed normal given the circumstances. The only person to contradict this description of Stephen's behaviour was the first officer on the scene, who claimed that Stephen, quote, seemed to be very excited. I told him to calm down. On the 15th of February 1974, the judge, Mr. Justice Neild, began his summing up. He reminded the jury that the accused had no criminal record and made it clear that, quote, one of the main planks of the prosecution's case is the statement made by the accused and signed over and over again. The judge, however, pointed out that Stephen Downing had retracted his confession prior to the trial commencing. On the 22nd of February 1974, the jury returned after deliberating for just 1 hour and declared that they had found Stephen Downing guilty of the murder of Wendy Sewell. The teenager was sentenced to serve a minimum term of 10 years, by which time he could apply for parole. At the time, he would only be eligible for parole if he admitted his guilt. Stephen Downing refused to accept responsibility for the murder. He claimed that he had been coerced into confessing. Stephen stated that shortly after the police arrived at the scene of Wendy Sewell's assault, he was taken down to the police station for questioning. The 17-year-old was taken to the interview room and told that he may have important information regarding the assault. What followed was the interrogation of a frightened young boy who was in distress from seeing the severely injured woman. For 9 hours, Stephen was held in the interview room, being bombarded with questions, growing increasingly confused and uncertain of what was happening. Stephen had never been in trouble with the police. He had never stepped foot in a police station, and now here he was, being interrogated by 2 seasoned detectives. Stephen was also unaware that he was entitled to have a solicitor present, and had not been cautioned. Intimidated, scared, and confused, after 9 hours without food, drink, or rest, Stephen was asked to sign his witness statement. He tried to read the account, but the 17-year-old, who had a reading age of just 11 years old, struggled to comprehend the words on the page. Yet he trusted the police. After all, their job was to protect the innocent and to catch the bad guys. He had been raised to respect and trust the police, so when he signed his name on the piece of paper that had been placed before him, little did he realise that he had just signed a document which was to become his confession, on which it stated that he had violently assaulted Wendy Sewell at approximately 1 p.m. The confession and Stephen having bloodstains on his clothing that matched the victim's blood type seemed to point to him being guilty, but not everyone was convinced. Amongst those who doubted that Stephen had committed the crime was his family. His mum, Juanita, was adamant her son was innocent. She had reason to be certain. In his confession, he had apparently stated that he had attacked Wendy at between 10 to 1 and 10 past 1. However, his mother claimed that this was not possible, as Stephen was at home with her. She alleged that her son had returned to their home on Stanton View at lunchtime. It would have taken him roughly 3 minutes to traverse the distance from his work to his home. His mother claimed that he had been in the house with her at the time of the attack. Juanita pointed out that Stephen was anxious to check on a pair of baby hedgehogs he had rescued, which he was caring for in the garden shed. His mum also argued that if he had attacked Wendy prior to returning home for lunch, he would have had blood on his hands and clothing, and there was no sign of either. Stephen claimed that on the morning of September the 12th, he had been going about his regular duties in the graveyard, collecting litter, trimming the hedges, and maintaining the graves. He returned to the workshop where he stoked the fire, before heading home for lunch. During his interview with the police, he stated he saw Wendy walking among the graves. He saw her heading towards the Garden of Remembrance, and he recalled seeing her walking on the footpath which ran closest to the woods that stood at the boundary of the cemetery. He left the cemetery, waving to Wilfred and his wife, who were outside the gatehouse lodge. Stephen then made the short journey home, removing his muddy boots at the door and heading inside, where he had a cup of tea with his mother and tended to his hedgehogs. At 1:20, he headed back to work. As he walked through the black iron gates, he once again waved at Mr. and Mrs. Walker, and made his way towards the workshop. He stated that he did not reach the deconsecrated chapel. Instead, he came across the wounded woman on the path. Stephen would later tell the editor of the Matlock Mercury that as he knelt beside the injured party, a man with a gruff voice approached him from behind and threatened him, telling the teenager not to turn around, or he would be beaten too. Stephen listened intently as he heard the man's heavy footsteps fade away, and when he thought the coast was clear, he raced back to the gatehouse to get help. It is curious that Stephen failed to mention this mystery man when he was arrested, or during his trial. He was accompanied by Wilfred and 2 workmen back to the spot where he found Wendy, and Stephen recalled how the severely injured woman clambered to her feet and lost her balance, and fell, hitting her head against one of the headstones. Stephen knelt beside her on the grass and comforted Wendy until the ambulance arrived, and this, he claimed, is how he ended up with her blood on his clothing. For over 20 years, Stephen sat in a prison cell, continuing to protest his innocence. He had made several attempts to appeal his sentence. His parents never stopped fighting for him, and when they received a phone call of a woman who claimed she had sent information to a number of newspapers that could potentially free Stephen, his father Ray and mum Juanita paid a visit to John Hale at the Matlock Mercury, a local paper which was apparently one of the publications the woman had contacted. Don Hale politely listened to the parents, who had entered his office on that March afternoon in 1994 with a stack of papers and an eagerness to tell their son's story. It was Ray who did the majority of the talking. He was clearly passionate, yet filled with speculation regarding why his son was framed, and who he believed murdered Wendy Sewell. As a journalist, Don knew he had to maintain his unbiased perspective on the case. But it was hard for him not to be swayed by the likeable couple who sat in his office. Juanita was quiet. She seemed nervous but had a dignified manner. Yet in her eyes the pain was clear to see, the same suffering that echoed in every word her husband spoke. Over the weeks since his meeting with Stephen's parents, Don began to look into the case, and the more he read, the further down the rabbit hole he fell. He accompanied Ron Downing to the cemetery so he could get an insight into the area in which the crime occurred. When they got to the grave where Stephen had found Wendy, Don noted how low the dry stone wall was that bordered that section of the cemetery, and how easy it would have been for her attacker to have jumped over the wall and disappeared into the dense woods beyond. He also found it curious that although the oldest part of the graveyard was more secluded, the row of terraced houses on Burton Edge were in an elevated position, which led Don Hale to wonder if the police had approached the residents regarding the incident. Naturally, during any investigation of this severity, you would expect that the police would have conducted door-to-door inquiries in the area to collate witness statements. So Don was surprised to learn that this was not the case. Some of the people who occupied the houses on Burton Edge advised that although they were home on the day of the attack, they either were never approached or their statements were ignored. Was this because the police believed that they didn't need these witnesses, as they had a confession from the perpetrator? Or was it because their accounts differed from the investigators' version of events? One lady, whose house overlooked the cemetery, told Hale that at roughly 1 p.m. on September the 12th, 1973, she had seen a vehicle parked at the entrance to the graveyard. Its occupant's behaviour unnerved her to the point that she hurried inside and jotted down a description of the two men and wrote down the registration number of their vehicle. She advised Don that she had taken the information to the police, yet they turned her away without accepting her statement. What surprised Don Hale more was that despite the passage of time, the lady still had the cigarette packet on which she had written the information. He said, quote, "It was beyond belief. 22 years she'd kept that box. It was yellow and dusty, but still completely legible and damning to the police case." However, despite Hale diligently following this lead and discovering that the vehicle had been owned by a man who Wendy was apparently meeting on the day of the murder, this was not enough to allow Stephen to appeal his conviction. Don Hale was also approached by a woman who had learned that he was looking into the case and felt she had information that may be pertinent. In 1973, Jane Atkins was just 15 years old. For a year after the murder, she had been terrified to come forward with what she had seen on that September day, and it was only when Stephen appealed his sentence in 1974 that she testified in court. However, her testimony was deemed unreliable due to the delay in her providing the information, and this led to the appeals court refusing to overturn Downing's conviction. Now, over 20 years later and living away from Bakewell, Jane contacted Don to tell him her story. She recalled that on the 12th of September 1973, she had entered the cemetery to find her dog. She recollected that it was just after 1 p.m, as the 1 o'clock news had just been on. Jane recognised Stephen exiting the cemetery through the main gates. He was easy to spot as the teenager had a distinctive walk. Jane continued to explain that as she passed through the cemetery on the upper path, she saw a couple sharing a romantic embrace on the lower path. The woman had dark hair and wore a beige business suit, while the man was also smartly dressed, and the young girl recognised him as a well-known local businessman. If her testimony was to be believed, this meant that Wendy Sewell was alive after Stephen Downing had headed home that lunchtime, and therefore he could not have been responsible for her murder. Jane's mother, Margaret Beebe, stated, quote, "I remember the day well. Jane went off looking for our dog in the graveyard, and her younger sister Lucy and brother Ian went there too to play. Not long after, Lucy arrived back. Then Ian 5 minutes later. They were frightened to death, and to this day I have never got out of Ian what he saw. Jane is still frightened to death that someone will come after her because of what she saw." Margaret claimed that shortly after the incident, she was approached by a man who warned her, quote, "Keep your mouth shut or your daughter will be in the same place as Wendy Sewell." But the mother continued, quote, "I was frightened for my family, and Jane is still petrified. That's why we moved from Bakewell, even though we loved it there. I had to protect my children." Hale also learned that a witness walking her dog towards the cemetery had seen a man running away in the opposite direction around the time of the attack. His agitated manner startled the witness, who stated the man appeared to be covered in blood. Yet once again, this lead seemed to have been ignored. Over 20 years later, the Mail on Sunday started looking into the case and learned that the witness had passed away. However, they were able to track down the man she had seen running away from the graveyard. The newspaper reported that he was, quote, a relation of a local police officer, has been traced by us to his home in the south of England. He denies involvement, but has never been interviewed about the case. For 6 years, Don Hale sought to discover what really happened to Wendy Sewell, and in doing so he faced a lot of opposition, including threats to his life if he didn't cease the investigation. But the more Hale dug, the more certain he was of Stephen's innocence, and that someone else was responsible for the murder. When Don Hale approached the police with a request to review the case files and evidence from the case, he was advised that it didn't exist, as it had been, quote, burnt, lost and destroyed. Fortunately, not all the items connected to the case had been lost. His parents had been given the clothes Stephen had worn on the day of the murder, and the various bloodstains were still visible on the fabric. As for the murder weapon, which the police suggested had been misplaced, Hale learned that it had ended up at the Derby Museum. The pickaxe handle was retrieved from their collection and sent for forensic testing. The examination revealed the prints of an unknown contributor. However, there was no sign of Stephen having been in contact with the item. It appeared that from the very start, the police had honed in on Stephen Downing, and rather than checking other lines of inquiry, they ploughed ahead with pursuing the 17-year-old's conviction, ignoring witnesses and evidence that may have proven his innocence. What's more, Hale learned that when Stephen was first taken to the police station, he was not read his rights, nor was he advised that he had the right to have a solicitor present. During his 6-year campaign to free Stephen, Don Hale also fought for a change to the terms that dictated a prisoner's eligibility for parole. Approaching the European Court of Human Rights, he argued that a prisoner should not be denied parole on the grounds that they have continued to claim that they are innocent. In 1996, the law was amended to allow all convicts to apply for parole regardless of whether they have admitted guilt. The real victory for Stephen and his supporters came in 2002, when the Court of Appeal ruled that Stephen's conviction was unsafe, due to the fact that when he was arrested, he was not read his rights, nor was he given the opportunity to have a lawyer present. This, combined with the mishandling of evidence and witness accounts, as well as the lack of concrete forensic evidence, all worked in Stephen's favour. 46-year-old Stephen Downing walked out of the prison into a world that was so alien to him. He was only 17 years old when his freedom was taken away in 1973. He had never been on a date, never learnt to drive. There was no such thing as mobile phones or the internet. While inside he had endured bullying, he had been sexually assaulted and physically attacked by other inmates. Now he had to navigate life as a middle-aged man. He returned to the only home he had ever known, his parents' house, which was just a couple of minutes' walk away from where Wendy Sewell's life was ended and Stephen's life changed forever. The Mail on Sunday conducted an investigation into the case. Not only did they learn the extent to which the police had mishandled the inquiry, but they also uncovered suggestions of a cover-up. Not only were key witnesses ignored, officers who questioned how the investigation was being conducted found themselves being silenced through threats or redeployment. Yet the most important question, and the one that is often forgotten due to the injustice Stephen suffered, was who really killed Wendy Sewell. During Stephen's case, an important aspect of Wendy's life was left untold, perhaps in an effort to protect the victim, or to prevent prejudicing the jury. The press labelled Wendy the Bakewell Tart, a derogatory term which referenced her rumoured promiscuity. Wendy's marriage had not been the picture of marital bliss. There were rumours that while working at the magistrate clerk office, Wendy had started an affair with a co-worker, which led to her leaving the job. In September 1967, 3 years after their marriage, Wendy had left David. moving to rented accommodation in Bakewell. Locals suggested that she was having sexual liaisons with multiple men. It was while she was separated from David that Wendy became pregnant and gave birth to another man's child. In a rural town like Bakewell, which clung to traditional values, this was scandalous. Wendy gave up her son Thomas for adoption and returned to her husband. The pair worked hard to rebuild their relationship, moving out of Bakewell and settling at Green Farm in 1971. David told Don Hale during an interview for his book, Murder in the Graveyard, Wendy seemed unhappy and lost, and he hoped that by moving to the farm and having a renovation project to work on, and the pets to care for, would help her. When I read this, I can't help think that perhaps Wendy was grieving the loss of her child. She had to give up her little boy for adoption, and that's why she was so sad and lost. On the day of her murder, it was suggested that Wendy had left work to meet a lover in the graveyard. If we consider Jane Beebs had witnessed a couple embracing at 1 p.m, it is logical to conclude that Jane had seen Wendy with her lover. The Mail on Sunday attempted to trace who this man was. They learned that he was a local businessman, whom police eliminated as a suspect, as he was apparently at a sheep sale 18 miles away in Shropshire. A further investigation revealed that there was no sheep sale held that day, and the police were first made aware of this fact in 1979, yet they did nothing with the new information. The man rumoured to be Wendy's lover was approached by the newspaper, but he declined to speak with them. It also transpired that the number plate on the van, written down by the witness on Burton Edge, was owned by the businessman and his driver, which fit the description of one of the men the lady had seen, who claimed he was in Sheffield on the day of the murder. But this was proven to be false also. The newspaper also traced a former detective who was aware of the cover-up attempted by fellow officers. The detective told the Mail on Sunday that, quote, a young man came in and said his dying uncle had confessed to him that he had sworn a false alibi 6 years earlier, but a senior CID officer pinned me against the wall and told me, if this gets in the papers, there's going to be trouble. If you're going to get downing out, I hope you've got someone else in mind to lock up. The policeman continued, quote, I was terrified. I believed the businessman had been Wendy's boyfriend until the night before she died. They had a row and she wanted to finish it. He didn't, and that was the motive. The case could have been solved in a couple of days. The police already know the identities of at least 3 men who should be arrested and interviewed. The bastards who murdered Wendy Sewell are still out there. The speculation that Wendy was having an affair is dismissed by her widower, David. He told Don Hale that Wendy's father had passed away a couple of years earlier, and she had made the trip to the cemetery to look at the engravings on the headstones, as she wanted inspiration for what to put on her father's grave. This, however, is contradicted by what witnesses saw and heard on the day of the attack. So who killed Wendy Sewell? On the day she was attacked, 2 men were being held as suspects in the cells at the police station. One was Stephen Downing and the other was David Sewell. The victim's husband was held in police custody for 24 hours, while they questioned him and checked his alibi. When they concluded that David was in fact at work at the time of the attack, they released him, but this stay in the cells robbed him of spending precious moments with his wife, who died the following day. Was it her lover? Had the pair argued the previous day, as Wendy's friend had claimed? Was she actually heading to the graveyard to reconcile with him? Once she got there, did her lover brutally murder her? Eyewitness testimony seems to point to this being a valid theory. But why, if the man is known to the police and his alibi has been proven as false, has he not been brought in for questioning? There is suggestion that Wendy was the victim of an attacker who was responsible for the murders of Barbara Mayo and Jackie Ansel Lamb, who were killed in a similar manner to Wendy. Both girls have been strangled with an item of their own clothing. There are suggestions that Wendy's attacker had attempted to strangle her also, as was stated in the autopsy report, but was never brought up at trial, and was a detail that contradicted Downing's supposed confession. Even if she is not connected to Jackie and Barbara's murder, it is possible that she was attacked by a stranger. There has also been suggestion that Wendy was one of Peter Sutcliffe's victims, a claim which the police state is categorically untrue. The final suspect is Stephen Downing. Although most people, especially in Bakewell, believe that he was innocent, and many claim they can name the real perpetrator, it is hard not to consider that perhaps the police had the right man all along. There are people who argue that Downing has not been officially exonerated and declared innocent. It was the mishandling of the investigation which freed Stephen. The police spent £500,000 on reinvestigating the case in 2003. Yet despite this, Downing is still considered the prime suspect. When he was released, he was protected by the double jeopardy law, which meant someone cannot be tried for the same crime twice. However, that has since been abolished. So why, if Downing is the prime suspect, has he not been arrested? Could it be that there just isn't enough evidence to convict him? Or was he just a convenient scapegoat to protect the real killer? There are only two people who truly know what happened on the 12th of September 1973, and that is Wendy Sewell and her killer. David Sewell stated, quote, "It is in the interest of everyone involved if the identity of the killer was proved beyond doubt." This is definitely one of those cases that has so much speculation surrounding it. Sometimes this can make it hard to find the truth. What's your opinion? Do you think the police used Downing in order to protect the real killer? Who do you think killed Wendy Sewell? Stephen? Her boyfriend? Or someone else? As always, I would love to hear your thoughts. Episode 28 will be available on Sunday. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.